In this video, we will be reviewing the basic arithmetic operators provided to us in JavaScript to help us with our programs. Now, arithmetic operators are just simply your mathematical operators that you're used to from traditional mathematics. In this video, we will cover addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, remainder, and then two operators that we don't find in our traditional mathematics, and that is the increment and decrement operators, which are used extensively in the majority of the programming languages you will run into in your career. So let's begin with addition. Right here I've got an IDE set up. We've got ourselves a JavaScript file right here I titled Arithmetic Operators. And then down here I've got a JavaScript console running against Node.js so that we can see the output of what we are executing in our JavaScript immediately without needing to switch over to a browser and reload pages. This will just make it a little bit easier for us to see the output, and we can focus more on the actual programming rather than on reloading browsers and opening JavaScript consoles. Let's begin with the addition operator. So this is your standard addition operator, and right here we're going to go ahead and create ourselves a variable, and then in here we are going to simply do some addition and then plug the results of that addition into our addition variable and then spit it out to the JavaScript console so we can see the output that we are generating through these operations. So let's do 300 plus 50, and then let's go ahead and make sure we send it out to the console. And let's look at the results of that operation. We go ahead and run that file. And after running that file, we should see down here in the console 350, which we would expect. 300 plus 50 gives us 350. So that is simple addition. We can use this all over the place anytime we need to perform traditional addition inside of our application. The next one is subtraction, as you would expect. It is just simple subtraction. So let's do 1000 minus 500 to keep it easy. And console.log it out. And subtraction is going to go ahead and give us the result down here of 500 is what we would expect. So we have our addition operation right there. And now we've got our 500, which is the result of subtraction. Pretty easy to use. The syntax is identical to what you have probably already learned in some of the other videos. We've just got ourselves a variable, the assignment operator, and anything on the right-hand side of the assignment operator is executed as a statement, and the results of that operation is then plugged into the storage container, is what we like to call it, or the variable, and get stored in memory for use later on in our program. All right, so let's do multiplication next. So next, and let's multiply. Let's do something easy. 50 times 10. And then let's go ahead and send that out to our console. Let's run our script. And as we would expect, 50 times 10 gives us 500. Now we've got another 500 out here. We've got our addition, our subtraction results, as well as our multiply. And you can see the pattern right there. They all operate the same. You've got a number on each side of the operator, so a 50 and a 10. The computer takes those two, performs the defined operation, which is the operator in the middle, does the calculation, and then provides it to whatever's on the left-hand side of the assignment operation. Let's do division. We've got 1000. We'll divide it by 10. And then let's send it out to our console. Let's go ahead and execute it. And we get ourselves 100 because 1000 divided by 10 gives us 100. All right, let's talk about the remainder operator. Now, a lot of times you will hear people refer to the percent sign as the modulo or the modulus operator, or the modulus or the modulo operator. Now, that term comes from a different type of math called modular math. The reality is that JavaScript treats the modulus sign or the percent sign as your practical standard remainder operator that you'll find in some programming languages. It does not operate as the modulo operator. Now, we're not going to go into depth on that, but it is something you need to understand because some programming languages do use the percent symbol to represent the modulo in modular math. And in JavaScript, we've got our plain old remainder, and it just does your standard remainder math, which is exactly what you would expect when you divide one number by another number, and all you want to know is what the remainder is, so you can do some other operations. You can figure out what is odd or even. There's a lot of different uses for the remainder operator. You just have to make sure you understand that it is not the modulo operator like you'll find in some other programming languages. So let's go ahead and do this. Remainder equals, let's do something so we can see a remainder. So let's do some 35 divided by 2. And if we send that out to our console, we should see down here the remainder of that division. So right here, you'll see we get ourselves a, oh, I used our good old divide. So if we look right down here, we'll see 17.5 is how many times 2 goes into 35. So if we wanted to go the long way about it, we could do something to this result in order to try to get just the remainder or isolate just the remainder. But what the remainder operator does for us, just by using the percent sign, is it will strip out the number the number of times that 2 will go into 35, and then from that we'll get the remainder, or what is left over after that is done. So if we look at this, we've got 35 divided by 2, and if we go ahead and open up our calculator and we do 35 divided by 2, we'll get the 17.5, which we saw before, and we'll see that 17.5, so let's take 17, let's go ahead and add 17 to it. That gets us the 34, and then if we subtract 35 from it, we have a remainder of 1. I should have done the subtraction opposite so that we get a positive number. But you see right here that what we are getting when we use the remainder is what is left over after 2 has been divided into 35 as many times as it can. And then we take that number, multiply it by the 2, and then subtract it from the original number. And then that gives us the remainder, or the leftover amount. All right, so that is remainder. Now, the two operators that are really cool that we can use are our increment and decrement operators. So let's go ahead and look at increment. So a lot of times in programming, we are going to want to take a number and increment it, usually by 1, as we are counting up from 0, or if we are counting down, we might want to decrement that number. So this comes in really handy when we are working with loops. So when we are iterating over something and we need to count down because there's a specific number of times we want that iteration to happen, or if we're working with an array and it has a certain number of items in it and we only want to iterate over the number of items that are in it. So we want to get to each number in that array, pull it out, do something with it, and we don't want to go over the number of items in the array. We're not going to focus on arrays or iteration right now. Just know that increment and decrement are really good when it comes to iteration or looping over things. So let's start with increment. So let's just call it plus. Now, to begin with, let's take a number. Let my num equal 10. All right. So one thing we can do here is we could make it really complicated. Well, it's not really complicated, but it is something you see people do when they are unfamiliar with the increment or decrement operators when they're first starting to program. So we've got a number that we're starting out with. Maybe we got it from a database, maybe we got it from the internet, from a web service, or maybe we got it from a file or something like that. And so my num now holds 10 in it. And so we could take the my num and then we could add to it 1, and then we would expect to see inside of our plus variable, which is where we're storing the results of that operation, we're going to expect to see 11 because we've got 10 plus 1 gives us 11. So in all reality, these 3 lines of code, we just incremented our original number by 1 using the addition operator, which is what we learned up here, and then we plugged those results into the plus, and now we used it. A lot of times in programming, we don't want to sit and create unnecessary or additional variables that we're not necessarily going to use ever again. We're just using them for a really short amount of time to increment or decrement a number. So we could simplify this code and just say so we've got my num already up there. So let's just change this really quick instead of rewriting it all. So we can say let my num equal 10, and then one way to shorten that code would be my num equals my num plus 1. Now when we run this code, we're expecting to see 11 again, and this time we got ourselves an error. We got my num equals my num plus 1. Oh, because of the plus, we got rid of that plus because we got rid of that extra variable in order to simplify our code. What is going on here? All right, so my num. All right, so now when we run it, I hope everybody caught that. Before we had another variable right here called plus, and that was just another piece of memory that the machine had to allocate, another place where we had duplicate data. And so now instead of having a whole nother variable to store data, I am simply reusing my initial variable just by reassigning its value to whatever it was plus 1. So now when we execute it, we should see an 11. There we go. We got our 11. So let's go over this really quick, make sure everybody understands clearly what's happening here. We are defining a variable, so we're asking the machine to go grab us some memory in order to plug some data in that we're going to be using. We give that variable a name so it's easy to reference that memory. We're using the assignment operator to take data that's on the right hand side and plug it into that variable. So now we have a 10 sitting inside of my num. Now down here, instead of creating another variable to plug the results of the incrementation or the incrementation of my num, instead we're just going to take my num, we're going to take its starting value, we're going to add 1 to it, and whatever the result is of this operation, we're going to plug it back in as the value of my num, which is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And then when we get it down here, we've got my num. So we went from having 2 variables to try to manage the state of this manipulation or this when we're incrementing our initial value to using just 1 variable that we already had. And instead of trying to keep the original value, since we're really just worried about incrementing the value, we're going to take the initial value, add to it whatever we're incrementing by, and then plug that result back into my num. Now, the increment operator, what it does is it allows us to take it another step further. So instead of having 3 lines of code to accomplish the incrementation of the initial variable, what we can do is we can go ahead and use the increment operator. So I have my num up here equals 10. Now, instead of doing this, I can simply say my num plus plus and then do a semicolon. Now, when I execute it, we still see 11, meaning that the initial value was incremented by 1 and put back into the same variable, and now we have an 11 stored inside of my num. So the reality is that Using the increment operator, it is equivalent to my_num equals my_num plus 1. And so really, all we did was simplified that code a little more because JavaScript provides us a built-in way to take a numeric value and increment it by 1 anytime we want. Now, it only increments by 1 when you do it this way. If you wanted to increment by something else, like 10, you're going to have to do it this manual way. But if you're just simply counting up by 1 or down by 1, the increment and decrement operators are really, really useful for that. So let's go ahead and let's look at the decrement operator. So as you can probably intuit right now, the decrement operator, we're going to use right here below it, and we're going to say my_num minus minus semicolon. And this is equivalent to my_num equals my_num minus 1. And all this does is decrements the value by 1. So if we go ahead and execute this here, let's go ahead and let's add right here so we can see what my_num is before an operation. So here we're going to see a 10, here we should see an 11, and here we should see it go back to a 10. So let's go ahead and test it and make sure our expectations are met. We've got ourselves a 10. That's the initial value in my_num. We use the increment operator to increment my_num by 1. We get an 11. And then we use the decrement operator to move it back down to 1. And if we went ahead and we ran the decrement operator a few more times before we put out the results of that, we get ourselves an 8 because we were at 11. Minus 1 gives us 10, 9, 8. Right. So that is the increment and decrement operators, and you will see them a lot when you have an array. So let my stuff equal an array. Let's say that this array has some values in it. You're going to see it so that you've got some sort of loop going on here. Let's do a for loop. For let I equal 0, I is greater than my stuff dot length, and then we're going to say I plus plus. Well, if we're starting at 0, we need to say if I is less than my stuff dot length. All right, and if you've learned about for loops, you'll see that we're going to create a counter right here. We're going to check that counter against the length of our array. In this case, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 indexes in our array. And if I is less than the length of the array, so if our counter is less than the total number of items inside of our array, then we're going to go ahead and increment by 1 and then do stuff in here. Do stuff. So here you can see we are using the increment operator to increment an initial counter by 1 in order to loop through something. In this case, we're looping through an array, and then we could do all kinds of stuff by pulling out let current value equal my stuff, and then the current location in the array that we're trying to work with, and then we can modify current value somehow. So I can say current value equals current value remainder 75. That of course is all contrived, but you can see what I'm getting at here. The increment operator is really good when we're working with arrays. We're trying to iterate over the contents of array. We're going to pull out that contents and then we're going to do something to it. Of course, what we do to it could be all kinds of different things based on what you're trying to accomplish in your program. Now, hopefully that helps you out. We've got our addition, our subtraction, our multiply, our divide, our remainder, and then two cool new ones that you don't see in traditional math, and that is the increment operator right here, and then the decrement operator.